All right, good evening, everyone. If you'd like to take your seats, we're about to begin here. Well, first off, I want to thank everybody for coming out here this evening. This is such an important issue. It's one that's dear to Hillside. I think it's dear to all of us who are here. The fact that Jesus Christ said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And he is all about life and not about death. And so, although people don't want to consider the topic, abortion is a matter of life and death. It is the murder of innocent, and that is abomination to our Lord and Savior. And so it's such an important topic. And so we're very grateful to have these three men out from CCBR to give this presentation, to help inform us, to challenge us. And I hope that we will go from here with a desire and just a firm foundation, knowing what we believe and why we believe it. And so we'll open up in prayer. Just to let you know, we're going to have about a 45-minute session here, and then we'll have a little time of coffee break. We'll go to the back there. We'll have some coffee, some iced tea, some snacks have been prepared, and then there's they have some material out there you guys can look at as well. And then we'll come back. We'll have a free will offering if anybody would like to bless these men for their time and for coming out here. And then we'll have another session after that. Let's open up in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this evening. We give you thanks for these gentlemen who have come out. We give you thanks for the hard work that they are doing, going out on the streets, proclaiming that there's life in Christ. And we're so grateful for the work that they are doing. And our heart grieves, Lord, and it will grieve probably more after we see the condition of abortion in this country tonight. And I ask, Lord, that help us to love what you love. Help us to hate what you hate. And may our lives be transformed by your truth, Lord. And may we go from here challenged to boldly proclaim your gospel, Lord. This is one of the issues. It's not the only issue, Lord, but it's such a disgrace that our country is murdering so many babies, Lord. And we just ask for mercy, Lord. We ask for mercy on this country. We ask for mercy on the leadership. We ask for mercy on everybody who is making those decisions. We ask for mercy on the doctors who are performing all these and who are prescribing all this medication and everything that's going on. We just ask for mercy, Lord. Just be merciful. Touch their hearts. Help open their eyes to see what they are doing. And we just pray, Lord, that you'll be glorified through us and through everything that happens. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Awesome. Thank you, Pastor Mike. Everyone can hear me? Yes. Awesome. I think I'll just introduce myself, and I'm going to let the two fellows here with me, my colleagues, introduce themselves in person, and you guys can say whatever you want to say about yourselves. Only the truth, though, okay? So my name's Kyle Coffey. I work as the Manitoba Outreach Director for CCBR, and so that means I'm kind of leading CCBR's operations here in Manitoba. And just a little bit about our organization, and I'll get to more of that later towards the end of the evening, but we're a street outreach organization that educates Canadians on the truth about abortion, to make abortion unthinkable here in Canada. I live with my wife and our 5 kids in St. Adolphe, Manitoba, so not too far away, but not terribly close either, but we're really happy to be out here. Josh, if you want to. Yes.
Hello, I am Joshua Dick. I am the Winnipeg Volunteer Coordinator for CCBR. I live with my wife in Niverville. I actually grew up in Rosetown, close to this area, so this is a little bit like a homecoming for me.
And my name is Jerome Falk. I am originally from Winkler area. I live in Winnipeg now with my wife Samantha. And I guess my claim to credibility is I'm Joe Wilson's first cousin. So.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So one thing I want to note, you do have a package. I'll talk about that later on the chairs in front of you. But one thing I want to point your attention to right now is this blank sheet of paper. This is largely an informational talk, and so there'll be a Q&A at the end, so feel free to write down questions, write down notes. You'll have a pen with your package, is my understanding, guys, yeah? So you'll have a pen nearby as well, and so feel free to write down lots of notes and questions, and we'd love to answer your questions at the end. Sorry, Jerome?
If you're missing a pen or a piece of paper for note taking, then just raise your hand and I'll come and get you what you need.
Oh, yeah. Awesome, awesome, awesome. All right, well, I'm just going to open with a bit of a story. About a year ago, I was doing outreach at the University of Manitoba. My colleagues and I were out on the sidewalks talking with people, talking with the students going by about the issue of abortion. And this young lady, she must have been 20 years old, she comes up to me and we start talking about abortion. And in that conversation, she shares with me that she had an abortion back in high school. And I asked her, what factors led you to feel like that was the right choice to make? And she told me that she had bought a very expensive prom dress, and that if she stayed pregnant, that she wouldn't be able to fit in that dress at graduation. And so she chose to terminate the pregnancy. And I was just listening to that, and like I've heard all sorts of things out on the street, and I was just in shock. Usually people who give me a reason for why they've had an abortion, give kind of a serious, tragic story. And I was just kind of in shock, but I tried my best to respond, as well as I could in a way that would further the conversation. And so we talked about the humanity of the child in the womb, and then we talked about how abortion is an act of violence against that child. And I could tell that she was beginning to think about abortion more seriously. And I don't know if she left that day completely against abortion. But before she left, I asked her, I said, if somebody had come to you when you were pregnant in high school and had said to you, I'm willing to adopt your child, keep it an open adoption, and you could be involved with this child as much as you want as you're in high school and afterwards. If someone had come to you with a suggestion such as that, knowing what you know now, would you have made a different choice? And she thought about it, and she said, yes, I would have kept my child. Right? Isn't that sad? That's all it would have taken. And there would be a little boy or girl here today. And, so it showed just in a few minutes, that conversation went from being, well, I had to fit in my prom dress for graduation, and getting an abortion is a very normal way to deal with that kind of problem. And in a few minutes, that conversation changed to, well, I didn't know who my child was or what abortion was, and I didn't know what my options were, right? And that is the country that we live in today. We're 4 generations into abortion access in Canada, where abortion is seen as not really a big deal. It's seen as a default way to respond to an unplanned pregnancy. And, at best, it's seen as a necessary evil that people can be maybe torn up about choosing. It's a difficult choice for a woman to have to make, but it's still her choice, right? You hear people frame abortion like that. Or maybe on the other end of the spectrum, increasingly framing it as a positive social good, right? But at any rate, framing it as being central to female equality. The goal for this presentation is to give you an introductory understanding to the situation of abortion in Canada, and then also how we got here as a country, right? We kind of need to know where we are and how we got here before we can move forward, right? And we'll also talk a little bit about that as well after the break. I'll share with you about the pro-life movement, how it's set up, and share some opportunities for everyone here to get involved. But before we get to the break, what I want to cover is, yes, the situation of abortion in Canada today. Where are we, right? And then also a couple trends towards how we got here. One is the cultural trend. I'm going to cover the through the lens of the sexual revolution, because I think that's the main driver of abortion here in Canada, and then also some of the political, legal changes over the last few decades. Okay, does that all sound good? Yeah? Awesome. So where are we with abortion in Canada? So right now, there are no laws that protect any child in the womb at any stage of pregnancy, right from conception all the way until birth. Someone can get an abortion for any reason or for no reason at all. They don't have to give a reason to have an abortion. It's just assumed to be a fundamental right to have access to that action, to that procedure. And in terms of, at what ages are children aborted, Canada doesn't really track these things very well. We have one category for 20 plus weeks, and then everything else under that in one or two categories. About 1,000 abortions happen every year after 20 weeks, and there's about 100,000 abortions every year in total, and about 90% of those are in the first trimester. So that's kind of when people are having abortions. In terms of where abortions happen, in Manitoba, which I think is what's of most interest to people, abortions happen at Brandon Hospital, and then they happen at the Women's Hospital that's associated with the Health Sciences Center in Winnipeg. So those are the two hospitals that do abortions in Manitoba, as well as a private health clinic called the Women's Health Clinic. And I put that in scare quotes because mostly what they do is abortion or things that support abortion. So I don't think that has anything to do with healthcare. So it's a bit of a misnomer, their organizational title. In terms of a little bit more on the legal side of things, I think it's really important as parents, as grandparents, to know that kids don't need parental consent or notification to have abortion here in Manitoba or anywhere in Canada. If you go to the Women's Health Clinic website, it's really interesting the things that they put on there. Right where they have abortion mentioned, the first thing they tell people is this, bolded, right on the website, is abortion is legal. You don't need parental or spousal consent to have an abortion, right? So that's the first thing, that's the facts about the situation that they want everyone to know right away when they're looking for their abortion options. In terms of the impact of abortion, we've had about 4 million abortions since 1969, over the last 50-some years, over 4 million. And just to see how deep this runs, for every child that is aborted, right, there's not just a mother who suffers the wound of lost motherhood, but there's also a father who suffers the wound of lost fatherhood. Whether they chose that or not, that is a psychological, spiritual wound nonetheless, right? Because all sin wounds us, right? And Christ is our healer. There's also grandparents, siblings, aunts and uncles. The shock waves of abortion really just ripple through our culture, leaving virtually no one untouched. I think probably everyone, even in an area like this, in your family tree, whether you know it or not, have probably been impacted by abortion in some way or another. Tonight, though, is about understanding, how where we are and how we got here. The next talk that we're going to give, though, which is on May 25th, a few Sundays from now, Jerome is actually going to teach us how to respond to the culture where it is. How do we talk about abortion? With compassion, with gentleness, but in a way that is very effective. So today is about understanding, but the training to take that understanding to the culture and make a difference, that's going to happen in our next talk on the 25th. I said we're going to talk about the sexual revolution as a trend that led us to where we are here today. Before the 1960s, our culture's ideas around sexuality were broadly Christian. And what I mean by that is people thought and generally practiced the idea that sexuality should be reserved to a monogamous, heterosexual marriage, right? And the sexual revolution is the cultural, political trends and movements and people moving away from that understanding to where we are today, where it seems almost anything goes on sexual matters, right? Maybe the one standard that we have is consent, and that seems to be really razor thin, even in the way our culture understands it. The sexual revolution, by breaking down the family, breaking down family bonds, breaking down marriages, and preventing marriages from forming in the first place, really has brought untold misery and pain to just generations of people. And because it is the main driver of abortion, the demand for abortion, it actually is the deadliest, the bloodiest revolution in human history. I think in terms of the sheer numbers, it's not even close. While there are many different architects to the sexual revolution, there are three figures that I want to give you a little bit of a biography on and the impact of their work here today, just due to the sheer outsized influence they had on the culture. The first is the aspiring anthropologist Margaret Mead. She spent 9 months with her colleague in the Pacific island of Samoa studying the sexual practices, the sexual culture of the Pacific Islanders there. And in 1928, they produced this landmark study called Coming of Age in Samoa. In that book, they document, or they assert that traditional and Christian sexual ethics were not something that was necessary for human flourishing, not something that worked and accorded with the way God designed us, but rather they were just a social construct that at best was outdated, but possibly even dangerous or unhealthy to follow. Right? So if you're living in a monogamous marriage, maybe that's unhealthy, right? If you're waiting to have sex until marriage, maybe that's just outdated and unnecessary, right? Like that's what the book is saying. And the reason they were able to say that is because she depicts the Samoan culture as being this idyllic Eden where everybody lives in almost perfect harmony. It's almost utopian the way she frames it. And most importantly, that culture, she said, has no strict moral codes around sexuality. And in fact, she asserts that teenagers in Samoan culture at the time were encouraged by their elders, encouraged by broader society to be promiscuous, to have many sexual partners, to engage in a type of free love hookup culture. So that's how she depicts Samoa and saying, hey, this is a healthy, functioning society, and they don't live by Christian sexual standards. Okay, so that's the case that she's made in that book. This book becomes the most circulated anthropological book ever written. It becomes mandatory reading in first-year anthropology programs, and it becomes foundational to modern sex ed and to social policy. And in other words, it kind of changed everything, right? However, in the 1960s, so a few decades later, the anthropologist Derek Friedman goes to Samoa. He's skeptical of Mead's assertions, her conclusions. He goes there and does his own analysis. He talks to the locals, some of whom remembered Mead from decades earlier when she visited for 9 months. And it turns out that Mead's work is just a shoddy hoax, that Derek Friedman showed that the Samoan culture was not some free love society, but actually was in some ways more restrictive, more strict on sexual standards than Christian cultures were, generally speaking. So very different. And in his book titled The Fateful Hoaxing of Margaret Mead, he writes that he went and actually talked to the two girls who were at that time quite elderly. It's 3 decades later. They were young girls at the time, and they were the two people that Margaret Mead got all of her research from on Samoan sexuality. She interviewed them. And what they told Freeman when he talked with them is that when Mead was interviewing them, asking all these, inappropriate questions about their sexual practices, that they were really embarrassed because it really broke their etiquette around sexuality. So they responded by feeding her a bunch of tall tales. That was something that Samoan culture would do, is kind of go to the tall tale side of things. Feed them a bunch of tall tales about their non-existent sexual exploits. And then Margaret Mead took those tall tales and put them in her book to prop up her preconceived conclusions around sexual ethics. And while her work has been debunked by Friedman, the impact of her work, the damage to our social fabric has already been done. After Margaret Mead, we have Alfred Kinsey, a former zoologist turned sexologist. Interesting career change. He, in 1948, published his first Kinsey report titled Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. And Time magazine reported that within 2 months, it had sold 200,000 copies. This is over 800 pages, this report. That Americans bought 200,000 copies. Apparently, they just couldn't get enough of the down low on what their neighbor was doing. And his work purported to show that most of the country was already engaging in sexual activity that by Christianity standards was at best immoral, but sometimes even shocking and just utterly depraved. So he writes in the report that 95% of men of the greatest generation, so this is a generation that fought during World War II, right? He writes in there that 95% of men were sex offenders by 1948 legal standards. Okay? That 85% of males had premarital sex, that 70%, almost 70% slept with prostitutes, that 30 to 45% committed adultery, that 10 to 37% engaged in homosexual acts, and so on and so forth. The 1 in 10 people are born gay, that slogan that the gay rights movement used to great effect, that actually comes from the Kinsey reports. Okay, that's the genesis of that lie. Now, this slander against the whole generation of men was based on fraudulent research. The scholar Dr. Judith Reisman, in her book Kinsey, Sex, and Fraud, that's the title, showed that a majority of the people that Kinsey interviewed were that sample, that pool of people that he interviewed to produce this report, that the majority of them were either sexual psychopaths, sex offenders, prisoners, male prostitutes, or promiscuous homosexuals. Now, whatever you think about those people, right? What if that's your pool, your sample that you're doing your research on? What conclusions can you draw about how the average person behaves? I think that question answers itself, right? So these were the lies that many Westerners wanted to hear, to tickle their ears, right? From Mead, they learn that, if we just throw these shackles of sexual repression off, then we'll finally be free, we'll be happy, and we'll be healthy. Right? So that's what they take from Margaret Mead. And then from Alfred Kinsey, what they take is nobody, not even my peers, not even my parents, are living by Christian sexual standards anyways. And so why continue to play pretend? Why engage in all this hypocrisy? Let's just be done with it. Right? So those were the two takeaways. Those are the two well-placed attacks on the Christian status quo in the early 1900s. And they've reverberated down to this day, impacting our culture. In 1953, Hugh Hefner launches the modern-day pornography industry with Playboy magazine, right? Normalizing sexual immorality in homes all across the country and the world. And the first centerfold he has in his magazine, the first nude centerfold is actually Marilyn Monroe, and he took those photos of her and put them in there without her consent, actually. And he is quoted as saying, because he's really inspired by Kinsey, okay? He's inspired by Kinsey, and he wrote, "If Kinsey had done the research, I was the pamphleteer, spreading the news of sexual liberation through a monthly magazine. If Margaret Mead and Alfred Kinsey are the mother and the father who birthed the sexual revolution, Hugh Hefner is their pamphleteer who helped mainstream the sexual revolution." I think that's the way to think about it. The circulation of Hefner's Playboy magazine took off like a runaway train and peaked in 1975 with 5.6 million copies sold each month. 5.6 million copies. And shortly, it was followed after by even cruder, raunchier magazines like Hustler, Penthouse, things like that. But now with the invention of the internet and the smartphones, right, we're all just a couple clicks away from pornographic material that Hugh Hefner couldn't even dream up of. It's so depraved, so addicting, and often violent, right? Normalizing sexual violence, even. Today, someone can be intimate with more women in an hour than their grandfather, their great-grandfather could have been in a lifetime, no matter how promiscuous he was, right? That's the sexual landscape that we live in, and a large part of it is due to Hugh Hefner and his predecessors. Now, what each of these people have in common, each of these revolutionaries, is that they have an agenda to push and that they lived out their sexual philosophies. They preached what they were already practicing. Their disciples and also their own biographers all say that all three of them, Mead, Kinsey, and Hefner, were serial adulterers and promiscuous bisexuals. Okay? This is how they lived. On top of that, it gets worse. Alfred Kinsey organized and filmed his senior staff and volunteers having group sex. Hugh Hefner ran Playboy Mansion and had a revolving door of Playboy bunnies. These are young, attractive women who are misguided, and he is paying them money to satisfy his lust for human flesh. Right? That went on for decades. He's since passed on. And when it comes to these three, at the end of the day, each of these architects, they're just miserable people living miserable lives. I can't imagine how miserable their lives were. And spreading that sin and that misery to millions of people. That's the contribution that these people have to society. And everyone bought it hook, line, and sinker, right? Like people got on to this way of living and bought into it, bought into these lies. It's really interesting because, Christians are always accused of being anti-scientific, and, our way of living doesn't concord with sociology or anything like that. When it's actually the opposite that is true, right? These people tried to pass themselves off as academic and objective, and it was just a veneer, right, to push their own lifestyles. So they are what they accuse Christians of being, right? Now, there have always been sexual revolutionaries throughout history. So, for example, you have the Marquis de Sade writing in the 18th century. You have, in the 19th century, you've got the Romantic poets. You've got Lord Byron. You've got Percy Shelley, who was married to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, the novel Frankenstein. And each of these people wrote and promoted their sexual philosophy, their revolutionary ideas in their writings. And each of them lived out those ideas, leaving a wake of broken women around them as they used and abused them. However, these revolutionaries of yesteryear, so Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and the like, they couldn't have the same impact, the mass impact on society, on the common person, that the ones I've talked about have been able to have. And that's because nature necessarily puts constraints on our behavior, right? With sexual promiscuity, normally what happened was you'd have a lot of unplanned pregnancies, unwanted children, right? And back when contraception was ineffective and abortion was unsafe and frowned upon, there was a lot of incentive to keep sexuality within the confines of a monogamous relationship, marriage. The only relationship that can really bear the weight of childbearing and child rearing. Okay? Now, all of this changed in 1960 with the advent of the pill, hormonal birth control, a technology no less transformative to society, no less groundbreaking than the invention of the atom bomb or the automobile. Finally, the constraints of God's design could be medicalized away, thrown away. Finally, people, the average person, maybe they bought into Mead's ideas or Kinsey's ideas, but they couldn't really live Hefner's lifestyle. Finally, those people could be a sexual revolutionary too. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that a faithful Christian couple who uses the pill is trying to be a sexual revolutionary. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I am saying, though, is that people's hearts who were set on lust were able to finally use this technology to then live out that way. However, when it comes to the pill, I do think there are good reasons why Christians shouldn't use it. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I really welcome that conversation in the Q&A, either at the break or at the end of the night. I think there's a good discussion to be had there. From a feminist perspective, having access to the pill finally leveled the sexual playing field between men and women. So women could have sex, right? Have sex with as many people as they want and not get pregnant, just like a man, right? Because the feminists often see pregnancy as a disease, as something to be gotten rid of. They don't see a woman's capacity for reproduction, for childbearing as a positive good, but rather something that holds women back and needs to be done away with. They would rather that women be more like men. And even men, they'd rather be less like men. They really want to push both sexes to the androgynous middle, is what they want to do, erasing both of them at the same time. In reality, it's not true that most men are much more promiscuous than most women. Rather, the truth is that the pill finally helped all women and men to become as hypersexual as a small cadre of high-status, hypersexual men have always been. Men like Lord Byron, men like the Marquis de Sade, men like Percy Shelley. Finally, now everybody could be like that, right? And so that became the goal, and that's where hookup culture that took over the university campuses in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. That's how that came to be, and in the rest of society. Now, there's a broad agreement among historians. They're not making a statement about the pill in its ethics. They're just noting a historical fact that without the pill coming on the market, the sexual revolution that took off in the 1950s and 60s never would have had the impact that it did have. Finally, people could have sex outside of marriage without consequences. Or could they? I said that a main driver of abortion is the sexual revolution. Well, if the pill's stopping all of these pregnancies, what has that got to do with abortion then, right? You might ask that. Well, the pill has a theoretical failure rate, and when people use it, that failure rate skyrockets. The Guttmacher Institute, which is the former research plan arm of Planned Parenthood, when they surveyed women who had abortions, why did you have the abortion? What were the situations, the circumstances around your pregnancy and abortion? 50% of the women who had an abortion had been using the pill in the month that they conceived that unwanted child. 50%. And so it just happens that when the pill fails, that child is almost by definition unwanted, especially when they've been conceived outside of marriage. And thus, you have the demand for abortion. Okay? So as the sexual revolution unfolds, as family bonds break down, marriages break down, people don't even get married to begin with, the demand for abortion access increases. Okay, so that's about all that I'm going to say on the cultural trends that have led us to where we are, from being a Christian country with Christian sexual practices to where we are today. Looking at things from a more political lens, some of the legal changes, judicial changes, and political campaigns. Before we get into that, I want to start just with where we began as a country in the 1800s. So in the common law tradition, abortion was restricted later in pregnancy, not from conception. It was later in pregnancy, often around the time of quickening. And quickening is when the mom can feel baby move, right? Because even Christians, going back into the early church, they often thought that ensoulment was around quickening sometime later in pregnancy than what we would say today with the medical knowledge that we do have. But with the biological discoveries of the egg, the ovum, sperm, and fertilization, conception, the process there, and what that means, being the beginning of a new human being, with those discoveries in the 17 and 1800s, you now have Christian doctors who are seeing this new scientific knowledge and drawing the very obvious conclusion that our abortion laws are out of step with the knowledge that we have about when a human begins. And so they start lobbying governments to change the standard from quickening, which was completely meaningless, biologically speaking, to fertilization, as when an individual human deserves legal protection. And so by the end of the 19th century, 1800s, you have almost all the states in the United States legally protecting preborn children from the moment of fertilization onwards, with one exception for life of the mother. Now, in Canada, abortion was made completely illegal, with the exception for life of the mother, in 1869. That's 2 years after Confederation in Canada's first criminal code. In fact, it was our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, that said that abortion saps the lifeblood of the nation. So that was the ethos of the time. In this law, abortionists could face up to a lifetime in prison, and women were not prosecuted for their abortions. This all goes to show that these pro-life laws, which were on our books just over 50 years ago, that they were not some holdover from the Dark Ages, although I don't think the Dark Ages were nearly as dark as people have been told. But they're not some, antiquated law that needed to get fixed. But rather, they were the result of cutting-edge scientific discoveries and a sign of progress, actually true progress for once. And so I think it's really important to know that our country protected preborn children for the first 100 years of its existence. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, things begin to change culturally, right? We have to remember that the sexual revolution is in full swing at this point. Another tactic that was used, though, by the abortion rights movement, used in its rise and used very successfully, and it's even being used today when people talk and debate abortion and abortion laws, is the idea of manufacturing fear around the health and safety of women living under pro-life laws. Back then, in the 50s and 60s, activists and media outlets, they would spit out endless propaganda about countless women supposedly dying in back alley abortions, and lies about how abortion laws didn't really stop abortions. They just stopped safe abortions. I'm sure we've all heard that before. When the truth of the matter is that the abortion rate went up quite significantly after abortion became legal, and abortion is not safe in itself, right? Every successful abortion kills a preborn child. Abortion is not safe for the mother and the child, so it's not a safe medical procedure. They would spit lies of hundreds of women in Canada, thousands in the States, who would die every year due to illegal abortion. But those stats were later shown to be completely fabricated. Bernard Nathanson, Dr. Bernard Nathanson, he was the former president and co-founder of NARAL, the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, which is a very prominent pro-abortion organization down in the States. He was very instrumental in bringing legal abortion to the United States. And he later became a Christian. And he was kind of a St. Paul figure, right? Had his own conversion and became a giant in the pro-life movement. And he confessed that back when he worked with the abortion rights movement, that they exaggerated and fabricated numbers. They exaggerated the number of maternal deaths due to illegal abortions by more than tenfold. Okay? So they were manufacturing fear through inflated statistics. Beyond using grossly inflated statistics, though, abortion activists held up powerful stories and powerful imagery of individual women who died in illegal abortions. One such case was Jerry Santoro. So in 1963, she was a married woman, she engaged in an adulterous affair, and she became pregnant. Now, she very legitimately feared telling her husband. He was a physically abusive person, and so she feared that abuse if she came forward with her infidelity and the fact that she now has this child, right? And so her and her boyfriend, her lover, they end up in a motel one night, and they attempt an abortion by themselves on Jerry and her child. And very tragically, Jerry ended up bleeding out, naked on the floor, and her supposed lover abandoned her and fled the scene. He was later arrested and spent a year in jail for manslaughter. Yeah. We'll get to him in a moment. My clicker is really failing me now. All right. So this photo, I've blurred out her bottom for just decency's sake. This photo was taken by police the next day, and activists took this image and her story and ran with it. They didn't leverage her death, her tragedy, for the good, to stigmatize domestic abuse. They didn't leverage her story for more supports and shelters for battered women and wives. No, they leveraged her story for abortion access. And instead of advocating for the mom and the baby who could face domestic violence, they advocated to pit the mother against the baby, right? And that's what they've been doing ever since. When it comes to these stories, and this one here in particular this image ended up in Ms. Magazine, which is a prominent feminist magazine, and really became the symbol of the abortion rights movement. I want to say just one word on deaths by maternal deaths, by illegal abortions. I think that every death by abortion is a tragedy, right? Whether it's the mother or the child that loses their life to abortion. Abortion is a terrible thing, and it claims people's lives all the time. And I think that women in Jerry's situation deserve understanding and grace and support. And her baby, regardless of the circumstances of that baby's conception, was a gift and should be received as such. But we can't lose sight of the fact, right? We can't let tragedies like this let us lose sight of the fact that we can't, in a just society, make it legal to kill an innocent person so that it's safer for someone to kill an innocent person, right? We don't do that in any other area of life, in any other law. Now, stories like Jerry's were really powerful. The abortion rights movement was able to use these stories, use this imagery to tap into women's very understandable, very natural sense of vulnerability. Women are more vulnerable when they're pregnant, when they have young ones. Okay, that's just by nature. That's how it is. And that's why they deserve their husbands, the father's solicitude to the max. But they use this fear to tap into a woman's sense of vulnerability and self-preservation and into men's protective instincts of the real women that they could see and they had relationships with in their lives. And what did pro-lifers have in response to this? Abstract appeals to the sanctity of life, to a child that nobody could see or touch, right? It doesn't take a genius to see how the deck was stacked against preborn babies in that situation. Now, finally, in 1969, we have this guy. I want to make sure I'm not clicking too much. Justin Trudeau's father, oh my goodness, Pierre Trudeau, his government tabled abortion legislation for debate. Like father, like son, as they say, right? Now, abortion was included in an omnibus bill. And what that means is that there are many different issues in that bill bundled together. It wasn't just a bill about abortion. It was a bill that included a provision to liberalize abortion laws, but also to liberalize divorce laws, to decriminalize contraception, to decriminalize homosexuality. So there was a lot of things tied to human sexuality, let's say, in this bill. And some of them were more popular, some of them were less popular, but politicians had to vote yes or no on the whole thing. And because all these issues were bundled together for strategic reasons, right, it made it hard to form a united opposition against any one of those items. And so the bill quite easily passed and became law. This is in 1969. And again, you know, the sexual revolution has been in full swing for a couple decades. The pill's been out for 9 years at this point. And, you know, the sentiment of the day is captured by Pierre Trudeau himself when he famously said to reporters who were questioning him, you know, there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. Does anybody remember that quote? Yeah. Yeah, that became kind of the slogan of the day. Now, a little bit about this bill. So it legalized abortion in the cases where the mother's life, or her health, was at risk. And each woman had to apply to an abortion, a therapeutic abortion committee at a hospital, a panel of 3 doctors who would then review her application and then vote for or against it and approve or deny her abortion request. And in the legislation, health was very vaguely defined. And so whether an application got approved or not for abortion really depended on the beliefs, the moral beliefs of those doctors on the committee. And so you ended up with this situation where some hospitals, some therapeutic abortion committees, would approve most or almost all abortion applications because they were pro-choice doctors. And then you'd have committees with pro-life doctors who would deny almost all or all abortion applications. And so you had really inequitable access to abortion all across the country. And as you can imagine, with a situation like that, a situation as important as abortion, important to people, as you can imagine, these committees became very politicized. Right? So you'd have pro-life organizations and pro-choice organizations campaigning on the local level to get pro-life or pro-choice doctors on these committees. Even at the hospital board level, there would be campaigns as well, because if pro-lifers could control a hospital board, then they could just get rid of the therapeutic abortion committee entirely, and abortions would not be provided at that hospital at all. And that actually worked in the Maritimes and some provinces out there, but also it worked in different rural areas across Canada. I know my grandma, I'm from up in the Dauphin area. She talks about kind of the fight over the hospital board there in Dauphin way back when. They don't do abortions there. I guess they kept it out of that hospital. And so despite these tactics, this fight over therapeutic abortion committees, abortion under this legal regime very unfortunately becomes the second most popular medical procedure after tonsillectomies. Okay? So it's only less common than tonsillectomies. Now, alongside Justin Trudeau, again, I'm glad we're done with Justin Trudeau, sorry. Alongside Pierre Trudeau, another hero for the abortion rights movement appears in 1969. Henry Morgentaler. Who remembers Henry Morgentaler? Yes? Okay. He got the Order of Canada before he died. That's how our country remembers him. Another man I might note, actually. So even the feminists need men in their lives to do their dirty work for them. So Morgentaler was a Holocaust survivor. And he lost a lot of his immediate family in the death camps. And that really formed his moral intuitions and what he thought about abortion. He thought abortion should be legal, not just so there was less Jerry Santoros in the world, women dying from unsafe abortion, but also because he thought it was better for some children. He once said that well-loved children grow into adults who do not build concentration camps, do not rape, and do not murder. So he thought abortion access, by aborting children who might be neglected later in life, he thought that would prevent future Holocausts. When he started, so this is 1969, abortion, again, was limited to hospitals and hospitals with therapeutic abortion committees. He said, that's not good enough. We need to do better for women. And so what does he do? He starts up private clinics. No therapeutic abortion committee to approve an abortion, just the abortionist approves the abortion, right? And so he starts that up in Quebec. And despite having numerous police raids, having numerous charges and arrests, the juries acquit him every single time. And by 1973, Morgentaler reports having done 5,000 abortions, 5,000 children. And by 10 years later, 1983, he's no longer facing legal challenges in Quebec. He's no longer getting police raids and things of that sort. And so what does he do? He starts opening up clinics all across the country, including one in Winnipeg on Corridon Avenue. I actually know a lady who has a small business in the same building as the old Morgentaler abortion clinic. And I was really curious, of course. And I was like, what's that like, having a business in this building? And she said, well, I made sure to get it exorcised of any demonic influence. And I think that was pretty wise. So you have Morgentaler starting up these clinics all across the country. Now, I mentioned juries would acquit him. Well, the Crown appealed one of those acquittals, and eventually that made its way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. And in 1988, the Supreme Court hands down the decision for R.V. Morgentaler. And what they do in that decision is they strike down the 1969 abortion law. And so there's this legal vacuum where Parliament needs to make a new law. Now, it's important to note that this court decision, despite what you might hear in the media, despite what you might hear from certain talking heads, like our former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, this court case, did not create a constitutional right to abortion. It was a different case than the 1973 Roe v. Wade case in the States. which actually did create a constitutional right to abortion. Although the justices in their legal opinions talk about how women need abortion, they don't really say when, and they don't really say under what conditions. There's just this general pro-choice sentiment in their decisions. And what they zone in on, what they strike the former law down under, actually, is because of the access issue. Because some people could get abortions in one city but not in another city, or in this province but not that province. So it was very inequitable, the amount of access. And so they saw that as a huge issue. No, we need to have a law that grants equal amounts of access all across the country. Okay? But what that law looks like, they didn't really get into in terms of when it allowed or restricted abortion. And to give you an idea of this, the most liberal justice on the court, Justice Bertha Wilson, she's a staunch feminist, very liberal. She's the most liberal of them all. She's the only one, in her separate opinion, who argued for a constitutional right to abortion. And even she said that she thought Parliament had an interest in restricting abortion at some point in pregnancy, and she suggests perhaps sometime in the second trimester. And if we had a law like that, actually, we'd save thousands of children every year, although most abortions would be before the second trimester. There's just that many abortions happening. And so what that court decision did, it gave Parliament the mandate to legislate on abortion, to come up with a law that respects this judicial decision. Now, the government at the time was the Brian Mulroney Conservative government, okay? And they really did not want to have to legislate on abortion. This was a political hot potato that people have been fighting over for at least a decade during Morgan Teller's crusade for abortion all across the country. And so drafting an abortion law was the last thing that they wanted to do. They were very hesitant, but they gave it an attempt. And so you have Bill C-43, which ends up being actually quite a liberal bill. It restricts abortion except when a mother's health is at risk. So it's kind of like the 1969 law, but you don't need a therapeutic abortion committee. Really, you just need the approval of one doctor, and it can be the doctor who does the abortion. And so this bill basically has a very token approval process. And so it's almost like abortion on demand, but not quite, okay? And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of people that were unhappy with this bill. Pro-lifers very understandably thought they could get a better deal, and so they opposed the bill. And then the abortion rights advocates, well, they're quite fanatical. They want abortion until birth, no questions asked. And so they thought they could get a more permissive bill. And so both sides opposed this bill. Even though it passed in the House of Commons, it ended up dying on a tie vote in the Senate. And since then, no federal government has been willing to even propose legislation on abortion. That was in 1990. Here we are in 2025, and no government has done that. In terms of our kind of current political situation, looking at the different parties, I'm not going to get partisan here. I'm just going to tell you some facts about each party. So none of the parties have policies in their party constitutions, the federal parties, that have seats in the House of Commons, I'll specify. None of them have policies in their party constitutions to legislate to protect preborn children at any point in pregnancy. And when it comes to pro-life politicians running for office, political candidates, only the Conservative Party allows pro-life political candidates to run for office. Again, I'm talking about parties that have seats in the House. Obviously, the PPC allows pro-life candidates. Christian Heritage Party allows pro-life candidates, for sure. Yeah, and in terms of the political discussion, do we debate abortion in our politics? What do you guys think? Sometimes? Yeah. Seems like we debate more whether or not we want to debate abortion. Do Canadians want to open the debate on abortion, this poll? No. Okay. Or we debate whether or not some conservative or right-leaning figure has a hidden agenda on abortion, right? And very unfortunately, there never is a hidden agenda. Oh, I wish there was. I wish that hidden agenda would just surface, but it doesn't seem to. So that's kind of where the situation is politically, right? And so I want to take a break now. So what we've covered is where we are as a country and how we got here politically and culturally. Looking at the sexual revolution, how it feeds the demand for abortion, but then also some of the political changes that led us to where we are today as well. So we can take a break now, and then when we come back, it's going to be a much shorter segment, probably 20 minutes, and I'm just going to go through the pro-life movement, how it's set up to respond to this crisis, because actually I think there's a lot of hope in the way the pro-life movement is responding. I'll share a little bit more about our work, and then ways that everyone can get involved. So let's just break for maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll get back here for about 20 minutes. And then we'll have a Q&A, and all the questions that you've written down, we can answer those for you. All right.